Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining.
So, in this chapter, we explore how Bitcoin does and does not scale. We start by looking at how people reasoned about scaling in the past. Then, the bulk of this chapter explains various approaches to scaling Bitcoin, specifically vertical, horizontal, inward, and layered scaling. Each description is followed by considerations over whether the approach interferes with Bitcoin's value proposition. In the Bitcoin space, different people ascribe different definitions to the word scale. Some conceive it as the increase of the blockchain transaction capacity. Others believe it equals to using the blockchain more efficiently, and others see it as the development of systems on top of Bitcoin. In the context of Bitcoin, and for this book's purposes, we define scaling as increasing Bitcoin's usage capacity without compromising its censorship resistance. This definition encompasses several kinds of changes. For example, making transaction inputs use fewer bytes, improving signature verification performance, making the peer-to-peer network use less bandwidth, transaction batching, layered architecture. So just to finish this off, we'll soon dive into different approaches to scaling, but let's start with a brief overview of Bitcoin's history within the context of scaling. So I'll pause here and I'll just try to summarize what we have discussed so far. So scaling has been a concern for Bitcoin, right? Dive into because different approaches to scaling. Satoshi also made remarks about how Bitcoin might need protocol, and he was a big proponent of big blocks in Bitcoin, and he released something known as Bitcoin XT. So, and now in retrospect, it's easy and very apparent for all of us to see that Bitcoin XT failed, and Bitcoin has surpassed in hash rate, in adoption, and in usage. So, scaling has always had an interesting story and history, and it's still something which is widely debated in Bitcoin because there's no easy way that we can see millions and billions of people using Bitcoin. And for this text purposes, this scaling is defined as increasing Bitcoin's usage capacity without compromising its censorship resistance. In the last section, we did cover this, and Faisal pointed out about how it might not, I might be misquoting Faisal after Bitcoin, which means more people running nodes, more people verifying source code and enforcing the protocol's rules. In the last section, we did cover this, and Faisal points that this mentions are like the ways in which it's done. So, and Faisal pointed out original implementation, now the current implementation differ very much in their algorithms and optimizations, and it's through things like Bitcoin, which means making more people running nodes, fewer bytes, by using something as simple as uncompressed and compressed public keys, and improving signature verification performance. So LibSec 256.1, I might be misquoting the technical name, was introduced in 2017, which optimized for signature verification by 5 times. I'm not remembering the name of the bib right now, but what it allowed to do is reduce the computing power of signatures by 5 orders of magnitude. And I think with the recent Schnorr signatures upgrade as well, we see that signature verification requires much less time, and making the peer-to-peer network use less bandwidth. I think this is mostly hardware innovation. So there's a section in this chapter that we will cover that Bitcoin in the last 15 years has also seen a lot of advancements just because of the hardware innovations. And I think with the recent Schnorr signatures upgrade as well, we see that signature verification requires much less transaction size and also helps with maintaining UTXO set by doing something called UTXO consolidation. So I'll take a quick pause and we'll move ahead.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about scaling, there's also a school of thought that believes that Bitcoin is not necessarily, or Bitcoin's ulterior goal is not to be a currency, rather it's a store of value. So yeah, I personally do agree with this. If Bitcoin ends up being a unit of exchange, great. But even if Bitcoin does not scale to that level where you're buying bread and butter using Bitcoin, to me, it still has achieved its purpose and it's still a successful invention as long as it's a good store of money.
Yep. Okay, let's go ahead. If anybody has questions, please feel to chime in whenever. Okay, history. Scaling has been a focal point of discussion since the genesis of Bitcoin. The very first sentence of the very first mail in response to Satoshi's announcement of the Bitcoin white paper on the cryptography mailing list was indeed about scaling. Satoshi Nakamoto wrote, "I've been working on a new electronic cash system that's fully peer-to-peer with no trusted third party. The paper is available at bitcoin.org. We very, very much need such a system, but the way I understand your proposal, it does not seem to scale to the required size." This was by James A. Donald and Satoshi Nakamoto's conversation from the cryptography mailing list in 2008. The conversation in itself might not be very interesting or accurate, but it shows that scaling has been a concern from the very beginning. Discussions over scaling reached their peak interest around 2015 2017, when there were many different ideas circulating about whether and how to increase the maximum block size limit. That was a rather uninteresting discussion about changing a parameter in the source code, a change that didn't fundamentally solve anything but pushed the problem of scaling further into the future, building technical debt. In 2015, a conference called Scaling Bitcoin was held in Montreal, with a follow up conference 6 months later in Hong Kong, and thereafter in a number of other locations around the world. The focus was precisely on how to address scaling. Many Bitcoin developers and other enthusiasts gathered at these conferences to discuss various scaling issues and proposals. Most of these discussions didn't revolve around block size increases, but on more long term solutions. After the Hong Kong conference in December 2015, Gregory Maxwell summarized his view on many of the issues that had been debated, starting off with some general scaling philosophy. With the available technology, there are fundamental trade offs between scale and decentralization. If the system is too costly, people will be forced to trust third parties rather than independently enforcing the system's rules. If the Bitcoin blockchain's resource usage relative to the available technology is too great, Bitcoin loses its competitive advantages compared to legacy systems. Because validation will be too costly, pricing out many users, forcing trust back into the system. If capacity is too low and our other methods of transacting too inefficient, inefficient, access to the chain for dispute resolution will be too costly, again pushing trust back into the system. He speaks about the trade-off between throughput and decentralization. If you allow for bigger blocks, you will push some people off the network because they won't have the resources to validate the blocks anymore. But on the other hand, if access to block space becomes more expensive, fewer people will be able to afford using it as a dispute resolution mechanism. In both cases, users are pushed towards trusted services. He continues by summarizing the many approaches to scaling presented at the conference. Among them are more computationally efficient signature verifications, segregated witness, including a block size limit change, a more space efficient block propagation mechanism, and building protocols on top of Bitcoin in layers. Many of these approaches have since been implemented. So yeah, let's take a quick pause here if somebody has questions, comments, or thoughts.
I mean, the author says that many of these approaches have been since implemented, whereas some has been successful and some have been unsuccessful. The block size limit change has been unsuccessful, whereas the segregated witness has been successful, and efficient signature verifications have also been successful. So they've been implemented, but some got success and some did not.
Right. And the fundamental trade-off between throughput and decentralization is covered in the block size saga, basically, not just the book, because it has many facets to it. So some people say that the block size wars is actually biased, and I am only 1/3 into the book, so I might not be well versed with the book to make that comment. But I do sense that it's easy in retrospect to realize that Bitcoin block size would never have increased. This is just my personal opinion, by the way, that the concern was that if the block size will always remain 1 MB, which was actually introduced by Satoshi in 2010, not in the original implementation. So a lot of people were saying that it effectively makes using blockchain by such few people that it does not have any economic use anymore, because most people will now be pushed to trusted services. So the solution that ultimately, long story short, was decided upon was segregated witness with the block size increase. So there's an interesting anecdote to this, that the segregated witness part of the transaction. So segregated witness is on a very high level just a separate processing of the signature part of the transaction than the rest of the transaction. So you store it and process it differently. So when you keep the block, you can actually not keep the signature part of the transaction in the block itself. So it saves you some space, and it also saves you space on UTXO set. So it was considered a great upgrade. But it was realized that because of that extra segregated witness space, you can give a discount to people because now they can include more transaction data. And that allows for people to use it in a way where they have not increased the block size deterministically by saying this is the final block size, but by giving a discount on the segregated witness. So I am personally not sure about how segregated witness allows a blockchain block size increase without actually enforcing it. So this is if somebody has more details about how exactly it allows the blocks to process and store signature differently so that it increases the block size without a hard fork. But yeah, there's an interesting angle to it that it eventually came to be abused by recent encryption scams. So the block size limit is 4 MB by that because of the 0.25%, 25% discount on the segregated witness part of the transaction by implementing something called virtual bytes. So for every 4 bytes in the segregated witness part of the transaction, it's counted as one virtual byte or 1 byte compared to the rest of the transaction data, which is 1 byte equal to 1 byte, 1 virtual byte equal to 1 byte. Okay, let's.
And another thing that segregated witness combated was transaction malleability. Now that we're discussing the virtues of segregated witnesses, it also got rid of transaction malleability.
Right. Yes, that was anyway waiting to be solved. So I think segregated witness overall was necessary. Yeah. Let's go to scaling approaches. As hinted above, scaling Bitcoin doesn't necessarily have to be about increasing the block size limit or other limits. We now go through some general approaches to scaling, some of which don't suffer from the throughput decentralized trade-off mentioned in the previous section. Yes, that was anyway waiting to be solved. So I think segregated witness overall is the process was necessary. Computing resources of the machines processing data. Let's go to scaling approaches. As hinted above, scaling Bitcoin doesn't necessarily have to be about increasing the block size limit or other limits. The most common. We now go through some general approaches to scaling, some of which don't suffer from the throughput decentralized trade-off mentioned in the previous computational demands. The downside is that it happens at the cost of centralization, as was discussed in the previous section and more in depth in section 1. Besides the negative effects on full node decentralization, vertical scaling might also negatively impact Bitcoin's mining decentralization and security in less obvious ways. Let's have a look at how miners should operate. Say a miner mines a block at height 7 and publishes that block on the Bitcoin network. It will take some time for this block to reach broad acceptance, which is mainly due to two factors. Transfer of the block between peers takes time due to bandwidth limitations. Validation of the block takes time. While block 7 is being propagated through the network, many miners are still mining on top of block 6 because they haven't received and validated block 7 yet. During this time, if any of these miners finds a new block at height 7, there will be two competing blocks at that height. There can only be one block at height 7 or any other height, which means one of the two candidates must become stale. In short, stale blocks happen because it takes time for each block to propagate, and the longer propagation takes, the higher the probability of stale blocks. Suppose that the block size limit is lifted and the average block size increases substantially. Blocks would then propagate slower across the network due to bandwidth limitations and verification time. An increase in propagation time will also increase the chances of stale blocks. Miners don't like to have their blocks stale because they lose their block reward, so they will do whatever they can to avoid this scenario. The measures they can take include postponing the validation of an incoming block, also known as validation-less mining. Further discussed in section 9, miners can just check the block header's proof of work and mine on top of it, while in the meantime they download the full block and validate it, connecting to a mining pool with greater bandwidth and connectivity. Validation mining further undermines the full node decentralization as the miners resort to trusting incoming blocks, at least temporarily. It also hurts security to some degree because a portion of the network's computing power is potentially building on an invalid blockchain instead of building on the strongest and valid chain. The second bullet point has a negative effect on miner decentralization because usually the pools with the best network connectivity and bandwidth are also the largest, causing miners to gravitate towards a few big pools. So I hope that made sense that increasing the block size very crudely also increases the block propagation and verification time. Because of that, miners now will have more orphan blocks or stale blocks. So it disincentivizes miners to validate or propagate the entire block. So they would rather want to start mining on the block as soon as they receive it and by just verifying the valid proof of work on the block header. And through that, it involves trust in miners and it involves miner centralization because now bandwidth and connectivity become a very limited source because it's difficult to propagate blocks through the peer-to-peer network.
So increasing the block size not only deprives Bitcoin of decentralization, but it also deprives Bitcoin of a very important attribute, that's trustlessness, and also increases the latency of the network. So there are multiple drawbacks.
Right. And I think the whole block size war saga was, in a very simplified way, fought between miners and full nodes, where miners were incentivized to increase block size because that means more transaction fees. But full nodes will now have to validate and store the blockchain, so it takes more resources. But we see that big block is also a threat on miner centralization, not just full node centralization. And I think in a longer term scenario, as is obvious now after 6 years, that block size limit was definitely a no go for both miners and full nodes.
Right. Okay, just let me know if this is better. It's happening.
Sorry, say that again.
No, sorry, no, nothing. Where were we scaling? I lost it. Sorry, just a second.
Yeah, we were at horizontal
We
scaling.
finished vertical.
Did vertical.
No, we will start horizontal scaling now.
Yes. Horizontal scaling refers to techniques that divide the workload across multiple machines. While this is prevalent scaling approach among popular websites and databases, it's not easily done in Bitcoin. Many people refer to this Bitcoin scaling approach as sharding. Basically, it consists in letting each full node verify just a portion of the blockchain. Peter Todd has put a lot of thought into the concept of sharding. He wrote a blog post explaining sharding in general terms and also presenting his own idea called tree chains. The article is a difficult read, but Todd makes some points that are quite digestible. In sharded systems, the full node defense doesn't work, at least directly. The whole point is that not everyone has all the data, so you have to decide what happens when it's not available. Then he presents various ideas on how to tackle sharding and horizontal scaling. Towards the end of the post, he concludes, there's a big problem though. Is the above complex compared to Bitcoin, even the kiddie version of sharding, my linearization scheme rather than ZK snarks, is probably 1 or 2 orders of magnitude more complex than using the Bitcoin protocol is right now. Yet right now, a huge percentage of companies in the space seems to have thrown their hands up and use centralized API providers instead. Actually implementing the above and getting it to the hands of end users won't be easy. On the other hand, decentralization isn't cheap. Using PayPal is 1 or 2 orders of magnitude simpler than the Bitcoin protocol. Again, from Peter Todd. The conclusion he makes is that sharding might be technically possible, but it would come at the cost of tremendous complexity, given that many users already find Bitcoin too complex and prefer to use centralized servers instead. It's going to be hard to convince them to use something even more complex. So I think for all intents and purposes, I did not go too much into sharding and how it works, but I don't think any implementation has enforced sharding as one of the scaling strategies. Okay, let's go ahead. So this is now the next 2 parts, I think are the most relevant part of the current landscape in scaling in Bitcoin. Inward scaling. While horizontal and vertical scaling have historically worked out well in centralized systems like databases and web servers, they don't seem to be suitable for a decentralized network like Bitcoin due to their centralizing effects. An approach that gets far too little appreciation is what we can call inward scaling, which translates into do more with less. It refers to the ongoing work constantly done by many developers to optimize the algorithms already in place so that we can do more within the existing limits of the system. The improvements that have been achieved through inward scaling are impressive, to say the least. To give you a general idea of the improvements over the years, Jameson Lopp has run benchmark tests on blockchain synchronization and comparing many different versions of Bitcoin Core going back to version 0.8. So this is the graph of different versions and how much initial block download took in terms of time, I think, or is it, what's the y-axis? So figure 7, initial block download performance of various versions of Bitcoin Core. On the y-axis is the block height synced, and on the x-axis, it's the time it took to sync to that height. So yeah, with every version, we see it takes less time to do the IBD, and you get faster.
The time is in minutes.
Okay, great. So yeah, we see it's almost like I wouldn't call it a log curve, but
the latest version in the graph is version 0.22. That is like a light yellow graph, and I think that's on the extreme left. So approximately 7,000 blocks were downloaded in what I'm assuming 300 minutes or 400 minutes, maybe even less than that. This one, I'll show you. This one.
Right.
Yeah.
And are
Yeah.
these, so just taking a wild guess, are these purely because of hardware or just because of algorithms? So I think it's covered in the next section. But if what would
Yeah,
be your
that's
best
perfect.
guess if in the
I think
last
it has to be an integration of both because the software is updating. I mean, what they have showed in one of the axes is the version of the software, which means that the software also has a very important and a very imperative role to play, and that is why there is an exponential increase in the time required to download the initial blocks between version 0.8 and version 0.22. So it does have to do with the efficiency of the later versions of the software.
Right. Okay, let's go ahead. The different lines represent different versions of Bitcoin Core. The leftmost line is the latest, that is version 0.22, which was released in September 21 and took 396 minutes to fully sync. The rightmost one is version 0.8 from November 2013, which took 3452 minutes. All of this roughly 10x improvement is due to inward scaling. The improvements could be categorized as either saving space, RAM, disk, bandwidth, etc., or saving computational power. Both categories contribute to the improvements in the diagram above. A good example of computation improvement can be found in libsec 256k1 library, which among other things implements the cryptographic primitives needed to make and verify digital signatures. Peter Bull is one of the contributors to this library, and he wrote a Twitter thread showcasing the performance improvements achieved through various pull requests. So this is just because of the signature verification that we have seen. I think I remember reading up to 5 orders of magnitude saving in space and time. Performance of signature verification over time with significant pull requests marked on the timeline. I think
This was due to I think this was due to the updates in the libsec P256K1 library, which is used to perform cryptographic operations like verifying digital signatures, creating private public key pairs, scalar addition, and point multiplication, etc. So the library also got upgraded, and as a result of which cryptographic operations were also enhanced. I mean, they became more time efficient and time effective.
Right. And I think it was still the same signature algorithm in terms of the ECDSA signature algorithm and not some different signature scheme, but just the optimizations of algorithm gave us this much improvement. Let's go ahead. The graph shows the trend for two different 64-bit CPU types, mainly ARM and x86. The difference in performance is due to the more specialized instructions available on x86 compared to the ARM architecture, which has fewer and more generic instructions. However, the general trend is the same for both architectures. Note that the y-axis is logarithmic, which makes the improvements look less impressive than they actually are. There are also several good examples of saving improvements that contributed to the performance enhancement. In a Medium blog post about Taproot's contribution to saving space, user Merge compares how much block space a 2 of 3 threshold signature would require using Taproot in various ways, as well as not using it at all. So I think Taproot is also a great addition because, and I please correct me if I'm wrong, that it allows you to create a 2 of 3 address without necessarily creating the entire, without increasing the size of the P2WSH hash. And that allows saving space because now to create a multi-sig address, you don't need to create a huge address in size. So I think it covers input single sig 2 of 3. When it was native SegWit for 68.5 and then 10.45 virtual bytes. And after Taproot, both became 57.5. So it's like it looks the same on chain when somebody generates a P2TR address. And for script path, it's slightly different. I'm not sure what script path means.
Just a minute. Don't we have to attend that kickoff, Bitshala kickoff?
I think, are you talking about the chain code cohort?
Yes.
Okay, so I think yes. Tonight is one of the kickoff sections. So if you are enrolled in that, I think you should be there. So Faisal and I know are not enrolled in that. So if anybody here is enrolled in the cohort, please, I think you should attend that.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I will do that. Yeah.
Okay, let's go ahead. A 2 of 3 multisig using native SegWit. require a total of 104.5 plus 43 virtual bytes, 147 virtual bytes, whereas the most space conservative use of Taproot would require only 57.5 plus 43, 100.5 virtual bytes in the standard use case. At worst and in rare cases, like when a standard signer is not available for some reason, Taproot would use 107.5 plus 43, 150 virtual bytes. You don't have to understand all the details, but this should give you an idea of how developers think about saving space. Every little byte counts. Apart from inward scaling in Bitcoin software, there are some ways in which users can contribute to inward scaling too. They can make their transactions more intelligently to save on transaction fees while simultaneously decreasing their footprints on full node requirements. Two commonly used techniques towards such goals are transaction batching and output consolidation. The idea with transaction batching is to combine multiple payments into one single transaction instead of making one transaction per payment. This can save you a lot of fees and at the same time reduce the block space load. And I think especially with Taproot, just taking a segue on Taproot, that it's become even cheaper because earlier when you used to batch a transaction, you need to create separate outputs for each payment for the different entities that you're paying out. But through Taproot, you can pay one address and it will, or I might be wrong. So this is take this grain of salt and somebody understands the details of tap script, please let me know.
No, I mean the gist is in the diagram. Basically, this is what they're referring to when they say the idea with transaction batching is to combine multiple payments into one single transaction instead of making one transaction per payment. So here basically what you are doing is that you need to make a transaction of 5 BTC. So you spend 3 and 36 BTC and then get a change. And then again you want to pay 5 BTC, 4 and 2, again you get a change. Then again you want to pay 5 BTC, 4 and 2, again you get a change. What you do is you consolidate these UTXOs, 4 plus 2, 6, 4 plus 2, 6, 12. So now you have 4 BTC. You directly give it to all the participants, like by consolidating your inputs, and you get only 1 BTC's change. So the number of transactions that happen over here on the right hand side are much less as compared to the ones happening on the left hand side. And that is why this can also save you a lot of block space and also transaction fees.
Right. And I don't think it has anything to do with Taproot because in Taproot you can specify multiple spending conditions for the same output, but you can't create multiple outputs in the same transaction.
This premise is general in Bitcoin. You consolidate your UTXOs to minimize the block space and to minimize the transaction fee as well. I think this is generic.
Right. Okay, let's go ahead. So we can see transaction batching combines multiple payments into a single transaction to save on fees. Output consolidation refers to taking advantage of periods of low demand for block space to combine multiple outputs into a single output. This can reduce your fee cost later when you'll need to make a payment while the demand for block space is high. So just to quickly touch upon, if you have very small UTXO amounts, they are either below the dust limit or too expensive to spend in the future. So if you have like a 10,000 SAT UTXO and now the fees is 11,000 SAT, it does not make economical sense to spend that output. But during times of low fee, you can combine many such 10,000 output UTXOs and consolidate them into creating one UTXO. So not only that saves you in fees, it is less footprint for the rest of the network as well, because now you have to only store that one UTXO instead of those multiple UTXOs now that you have spent. So it's a space saving technique as well. Output consolidation, melt your coins into one big coin when fees are low to save fees later. It may not be obvious how output consolidation contributes to inward scaling. After all, the total amount of blockchain data is even slightly increased with this method. Nonetheless, the UTXO set, that is the database that keeps track of who owns which coins, shrinks because you spend more UTXO than you create. This alleviates the burden for full nodes to maintain the UTXO sets. Unfortunately, however, these two techniques of UTXO management could be bad for your own or your payee's privacy. In the batching case, each payee will know that all the batched outputs are from you to other payees, except possibly the change. In the UTXO consolidation case, you will reveal that the outputs you consolidate belong to the same wallet. So you may have to make a trade-off between cost efficiency and privacy. Right. So yeah, just a quick pause and then we move on to layered scaling. But yeah, this is an interesting point that UTXO management and transaction batching are both coming with trade-offs to privacy. So it depends on the circumstances of that individual or company to consider them.
And can you repeat the highlighted text once more?
Yeah. So do you want me to read it again or explain it?
Read it.
Okay. It may not be obvious how output consolidation contributes to inward scaling. After all, the total amount of blockchain data is even slightly increased with this method. Nonetheless, the UTXO set, that is the database that keeps tracks of who owns which coins, shrinks because you spend more UTXOs than you create. This alleviates the burden for full nodes to maintain their UTXO sets. Unfortunately, however, these two techniques of UTXO management could be bad for your own or your payee's privacy. In the batching case, each payee will know that all the batched outputs are from you to other payees, except possibly the change. In the UTXO consolidation case, you will reveal that the outputs you consolidate belong to the same wallet. So you may have to make a trade-off between cost efficiency and privacy. Did that make sense?
Two nice points. Yes, they make a lot of sense. They also have drawbacks. This method of consolidation of UTXOs also has a drawbacks for a couple of them.
Yep. Layered scaling. The most impactful approach to scaling is probably layering. The general idea behind layering is that a protocol can settle payments between users without adding transactions to the blockchain. This was already discussed briefly in Chapter 2 and Section 3. A layered protocol begins with two or more people agreeing on a start transaction that's put on the blockchain, as illustrated in Figure 12. So yeah, just to quickly skim over the figure, we see that the layer 1 has only one transaction. So it's like protocol start transaction, and you do stuff off chain, you do stuff off chain, you do stuff off chain. And then when you want to stop the protocol, you go on chain. It's like very low burden on the Bitcoin blockchain. A typical layer 2 protocol on top of Bitcoin, layer 1.
Right, so the block in green could be like a funding transaction for a lightning channel, and the block in red could be the settlement transaction.
Yep. So if anybody is hearing this later or right now, we conduct Mastering the Lightning Network discussion sessions as well. So Lightning Network is the most popular and implemented layer 2 scaling solution for Bitcoin. So I'll continue reading. How this start transaction is created varies between protocols, but a common theme is that the participant create an unsigned start transaction and a number of pre-signed punishment transactions that spend the output of the start transaction various ways. Subsequently, the start transaction is fully signed and published to the blockchain, and the punishment transactions can be fully signed and published to punish a misbehaving party. This incentivizes the participants to keep their promises so that the protocol can work in a trustless way. So this is like on a very high level how Lightning Network works. You can understand it as just that parties, two people can now start the off-chain exchange by creating one start transaction, and they create multiple pre-signed punishment transactions, which is covered in Lightning Network and how it works. Once the start transaction is on the blockchain, a protocol can do what it's supposed to do. For instance, it could do super fast payments between participants, implement some privacy enhancing techniques, or do more advanced scripting that would not be supported by the Bitcoin blockchain. We won't detail how specific protocols work, but as you can see in Figure 12, the blockchain is rarely used during the protocol's lifecycle. All the juicy action happens off-chain. We have seen how this can be a win for privacy if done right, but it can also be an advantage for scalability. In a Reddit post titled "A Trip to the Moon Requires a Rocket with Multiple Stages," or otherwise the rocket equation will eat your lunch, packing everyone in clown car style into a trebuchet and hoping for success is right out. Gregory Maxwell explains why layering is our best shot at getting Bitcoin to scale by orders of magnitudes. He starts by emphasizing the fallacy that in viewing Visa or MasterCard as Bitcoin's main competitors and highlighting how increasing the maximum block size is a bad approach to meet said competition. Then he talks about how to make some real difference by using layers. So, does that mean that Bitcoin can't be a big winner as a payments technology? No. But to reach the kind of capacity required to serve the payment needs of the world, we must work more intelligently. From its very beginning, Bitcoin was designed to incorporate layers in secure ways through its smart contracting capability. What, do you think that was just there so people could wax philosophic about meaningless DAOs? In effect, we will use the Bitcoin system as a highly accessible and perfectly trustworthy robotic judge and conduct most of our business outside of the courtroom, but transact in such a way that if something goes wrong, we have all the evidence and established agreements, as we can be confident that the robotic code will make it right. Geek sidebar, if this seems impossible, go read this old post on transaction cut through. This is possible precisely because of core properties of Bitcoin. A sensible or reversible base system is not very suitable to build powerful upper layer transaction processing on top of. And if the underlying asset isn't sound, there is little point in transacting with it at all. So yeah, I think this summarizes how Lightning Network, for all its flaws, is still effective because it relies on Bitcoin layer 1 enforcing the rules of Bitcoin. And in any case that any party is cheated on in their interaction with other parties, they can go to this robotic, trustworthy judge.
Except the fact that we can show the difference that if you put
Let's go ahead.
Bitcoin search, there is more.
The analogy with the judge is quite illustrative of how layering works. The judge must be incorruptible and never change her mind. Otherwise, the layers above Bitcoin's base layer will not work reliably. He continues by making a point about centralized services. There's usually no problem with trusting a central server with trivial amounts of Bitcoin to get things done. That's also layered scaling. Many years have passed since Maxwell wrote the piece above, and his words still stand correct. The success of the Lightning Network proves that layering is indeed a way forward to increase the utility of Bitcoin. Conclusion: we have discussed various ways through which one might want to scale Bitcoin, increasing Bitcoin's usage capacity. Scaling has been a concern in Bitcoin since its very early days. We know today that Bitcoin doesn't scale well vertically, buy bigger hardware, or horizontally, verify only parts of the data, but rather inward, do more with less, and in layers, build protocols on top of Bitcoin. We have 15 minutes left, so let's start with the next section. And just a quick pause if somebody has any questions or thoughts. When shit hits the fan.
No questions from my end. Let's move on to the next section.
Yeah. Okay, this is interesting. When shit hits the fan, let's read through. Bitcoin is built by people. People write the software, and people run the software. When a security vulnerability or a severe bug is discovered, is there really a distinction between the two? It's always discovered by people, flesh and blood. This chapter contemplates what people do, should and shouldn't do when shit hits the fan. The first section explains the term responsible disclosure, which refers to how someone who discovers a vulnerability can act responsibly to help minimize the damage from it. The rest of the chapter takes you a tour through some of the most severe vulnerabilities discovered over the years and how they were handled by developers, miners, and users. Things were not as rigorous in Bitcoin's early childhood as they are today. Responsible disclosure. Imagine you discover a bug in Bitcoin Core, a bug that allows anyone to remotely shut down a Bitcoin Core node by using some specially crafted network messages. Imagine also you are not malicious and would like this issue to remain unexploited. What do? If you remain silent about it, someone else will probably discover the issue and you can't be sure that person won't be malicious. When a security issue is discovered, the person discovering it should employ responsible disclosure, which is a term often used among Bitcoin developers. The term is explained on Wikipedia. Developers of hardware and software often require time and resources to repair their mistakes. Often, it is ethical hackers who find these vulnerabilities. Hackers and computer security scientists have the opinion that it is their social responsibility to make the public aware of vulnerabilities. Hiding problems could cause a feeling of false security. To avoid this, the involved parties coordinate and negotiate a reasonable period of time for repairing the vulnerability. Depending on the potential impact of the vulnerability, the expected time needed for an emergency fix or workaround to be developed and applied and other factors, this period may vary between a few days and several months.
Like what this basically mentions is that it depends on the seriousness of the vulnerability. What approach is used to ensure that the vulnerability is fixed. Like for instance, the inflation bug, I think within a few days or maybe overnight, the inflation bug was fixed and nobody got to know before the news leaked out. Immediately, it was fixed overnight because it was such a sensitive bug. So yeah, the fixing approach of bugs is also depends on how high the stakes are.
Right. I think one of the recent interesting stories around vulnerabilities and Lightning Protocol was I can't remember the name of the Burak. Burak was the name of the developer who made a 998 of 999 multisig transaction and used it to spam the LND protocol implementation because it had some limits on how much data can it take, and a 999 multisig transaction exceeded that limit. So that was an example of how he did it without informing the protocol developers beforehand. And that was a live case, I think. And a lot of people have interesting remarks about that LND is not the Bitcoin core implementation anyway. So crashing it does not create any systemic risk.
Is there a limit? Are you aware? Is there a limit, upper threshold to which you can, to the number of keys that you can use?
It was some bug in LND's implementation. So it's not technically a bug in Lightning protocol itself. So it did not crash CLN nodes. So there are 3 or I think 4 most popular Lightning node implementations. One is Core Lightning, C Lightning. I think it's created by Blockstream. One is LND, which is created by Lightning Labs. So Lightning Labs had some optimization or implementation detail bug in which they did not allow after a certain size for a transaction to have. And Burak made a spam transaction, and he was aware that he's doing this, and it crashed all the LND nodes across the network entirely in just a few seconds. So they needed to, I'm not sure how they resolved it, but they needed to wait for a few hours before the network was alive again. It was criticized, and there was a lot of controversy that Burak, as a senior Bitcoin developer, should have perhaps done responsible disclosure.
But it would be interesting to do some research on what's the upper limit of the number of possible public keys that you can use in a multi-sig script.
I think there is some limit. I think it was 20 originally. I'm not sure if it was.
Yes. I think we discussed this in LBTCL as well. Yeah, I think you're right. 20.
And I think Taproot changes that. So Taproot allows you to create a 999 multi-sig output, because a transaction hash of a P2TR is the same as any number of signatories in the multi-sig. So it allows you to create a huge size. But what the problem with that is that you might have to reveal the transaction path, as in the spending conditions, when somebody is spending that. So when somebody is spending that, they reveal which part of the tree they are to spend their output. So that could be a very huge script. I'm not sure.
I don't think that'll be a huge script. If it's a bare script, then obviously it'll be a huge script, but it's not a bare script. You just need to produce a local proof.
Right. Hello? I've lost your voice, Faisal.
No, I just said if it was a bare script with hundreds of public keys, then it would have been very data intensive. But like if you're just providing a Merkle proof, it's not going to be as data intensive.
Right. I'll research more and find out some interesting document on what the LND bug was. But I'm pretty sure it had something to do with 999 multi-sig address. So that's something I'll quickly find out and share with the group later. Okay,
sure, let's go ahead.
This, can you scroll down? Yeah. This means that if you find a security issue, you should report this to the team responsible for the system. But what does this mean in the context of Bitcoin? As noted in section 7, no one controls Bitcoin, but there's currently a focal point for Bitcoin development, namely the Bitcoin Core GitHub repository. The maintainers of said repository are responsible for the code in it, but they're not responsible for the system as a whole. No one is. Nevertheless, the general best practice is to send an email to security@bitcoincore.org. In an email thread titled Responsible Disclosure of Bugs from 2017, Anthony Towns tried to summarize what he perceived to be the current best practices. He had collected inputs from several sources and different people to inform his view on the subject. Vulnerabilities should be reported via security@bitcoincore.org. A critical issue that can be exploited immediately or is already being exploited, causing large harm, will be dealt with by a released patch ASAP, wide notification of the need to upgrade or to disable affected systems, minimal disclosure of the actual problem to delay attacks. A non-critical vulnerability, because it is difficult or expensive to exploit, will be dealt with by patch and review undertaken in the ordinary flow of deployment, backport of a fix or workaround from master to the current release version. Devs will attempt to ensure that the publication of the fix does not reveal the nature of the vulnerability by providing the proposed fix to experienced devs who have not been informed of the vulnerability, telling them that it fixes a vulnerability and asking them to identify the vulnerability. Devs may recommend other Bitcoin implementations adopt vulnerability fixes prior to the fix being released and widely deployed, if they can do so without revealing the vulnerability. Example, if the fix has significant performance benefits that would justify its inclusion. Prior to vulnerability becoming public, devs will generally recommend to friendly altcoin devs that they should catch up with fixes. But this is only after fixes are widely deployed in the Bitcoin network. Devs will generally not notify altcoin developers who have behaved in a hostile manner, example using vulnerabilities to attack others, or who violate embargoes. Bitcoin devs won't disclose vulnerability details until greater than 80% of Bitcoin nodes have deployed the fixes. Vulnerability discoverers are encouraged and requested to follow the same policy. So these are some general guidelines, I think, for the Bitcoin Core GitHub repository about how to deal with vulnerabilities.
And they're very valuable. Like if you're a Bitcoin Core contributor, or even if you're a Bitcoin developer who actively monitors the network, and if you come across a vulnerability, how do you deal with it in a very sensitive and in a very appropriate manner? I think these are very valuable and virtuous guidelines that have been enlisted by Anthony Downs.
Right. Anthony Downs and thread responsible disclosure of bugs. This list displays how careful one must be when publishing patches for Bitcoin, since the patch itself might give away the vulnerability. The fourth bullet is particularly interesting as it explains how to test whether a patch has been disguised well enough. Indeed, if a few really experienced developers can't spot the vulnerability, even knowing that the patch fixes one, it will probably be really hard for others to discover it. The thread that led to this email was discussing whether, when, and how to disclose vulnerabilities to altcoins and other implementations of Bitcoin. There is no clear answer here. Helping the good guys seems like a sensible thing to do, but who decides who they are and where does one draw the line? Brian Bishop argued that helping altcoins and even scam coins defend themselves against security exploits was a moral duty. It's not enough to defend Bitcoin and its users from active threats. There is a more general responsibility to defend all kinds of users and different software from many kinds of threat in whatever forms, even if folks are using stupid and insecure software that you personally don't maintain or contribute to or advocate for. Handling knowledge of vulnerability is a delicate matter, and you might be receiving knowledge with more serious direct or indirect impact than originally described. That's an interesting take. Also leading up to Towns' email above was a post by Gregory Maxwell in which he argued that security vulnerabilities could be more severe than they appear.
Hey, like just a pause. If you get to know of a bug in an altcoin, okay, what would you do? How would you react? You know, this is a very severe bug and the entire ecosystem might crash and people might lose their funds, but it's an altcoin. How would you react? And only you knew about it, like a hypothetical situation.
So I think there's a very real scenario of it happening currently. So proof of stake is the recent upgrade to Ethereum.
No, it's a bug that only you know. It's not. I mean, this is what this is mentioning, okay? Because it's a very confidential situation. Nobody else knows. If you reveal, the system is saved. If you don't reveal, then the system collapses.
Right. Okay. I am the person who discovered the vulnerability, right?
Yes. Yes.
Right. I think it will be my moral duty to reveal it to the protocol developers who are developing it. And I think for that to happen, I have to first on the first hand realize that the protocol developers are actually trying to create value. So something like Monero, I think, is trying to create some value. I might be wrong here, but my understanding of it is that Monero is trying to create a unit where you can use it privately without anybody knowing about it. And I'm not sure how they implement it. I've got to know that there's some cryptographic primitives that they use which are separate from Bitcoin. And if I were to discover a bug in the Monero implementation, then I think I will want to reveal it to them before I try to exploit it. But if it's an Ethereum or Cardano or Ripple, I don't think I will be spending time on the first hand. But if I do discover it, I think I will not bother to contact. Whether I abuse it or not is a secondary question that I'll have to think about. What about you?
So basically, you have categories of shit coins, like lesser shit, more shit.
Definitely. I think Monero is the only interesting project. And I think something like Liquid and Fedi, which are layers on top of Bitcoin, are interesting. They are not shitcoins, of course, but they are also, I think, an attempt by drive chains and even Liquid. I'm only recently started to learn. So my opinion is very weak right now because I do not have it with sufficient backing. But Liquid is also a centralization risk to Bitcoin longer term because everybody trusts Blockstream and it's now being pitched as a scaling solution and not Lightning anymore. So yeah, if I were to discover a bug in that, I would definitely report it to Blockstream because I think they are acting in the best interest of Bitcoin. But yes, then Monero, and then if it's anything else, I'll probably exploit it.
All right.
Yeah, what about you?
If it's anything other than Bitcoin, then I'll pray that nobody else gets to know about the bug and the entire system crashes and everybody loses every single penny that they've invested. And they learn a lifetime lesson that a monetary ecosystem should be left alone and you shouldn't do jazzy things on a monetary ecosystem because the stakes are very high.
Right. Right. Fair enough. Makes sense.
I'm a mean person. What a mean Bitcoiner.
Nice. Also
Alright,
leading up to Town's emails, I'll continue reading. Above was a post by Gregory Maxwell in which he argued that security vulnerabilities could be more severe than they appear. I have multiple times seen a hard to exploit issue turn out to be trivial when you find the right trick, or a minor DOS issue turn out to be far more serious. Simple performance bugs, expertly deployed, can potentially be used to carve up the network. Miner A and exchange B go in one partition, every and else in another, and double spend, and so on. So while I absolutely do agree that different things should and can be handled differently, it is not always so clear cut. It's prudent to treat things as more severe than you know them to be. So yeah, I think this is like the security expert 101, that you always treat every vulnerability with more severity than it might or might not be, because there's something that it might teach you.
Objects in the mirror appear closer than they are.
Exactly, yeah. And I was curious if they mentioned an example that simple performance bug exploitedly deployed can potentially be used to carve up the network. Yeah, so something as simple as a performance bug, which someone might not think too much of because it's like saving some space or bandwidth. It could carve up the network potentially. So miner A and exchange B go in one partition. So I think it's called an eclipse attack, where an attacker. So I think this is accidental here and not some third-party attacker making it. But you can carve up the network without even realizing it by a simple performance drug. I don't know if Gregory Maxwell covers it in an example or in detail, but that's an interesting angle to think from. Continuing reading. So even if a vulnerability seems hard to exploit, it might be best to assume that it's easily exploitable and you just haven't figured out yet. He also mentions how it's somewhat incorrect to call this thread anything but disclosure. This thread is not about disclosure. Disclosure is when you tell the vendor. This thread is about publication, and that has very different implications. Publication is when you're sure you've told the prospective attackers. The last observation concerning the distinction between disclosure and publication is an important one. The easy part is responsible disclosure. The hard part is sensible publishing. Were you able to follow what the last paragraph is trying to illustrate?
Let's repeat it once again. Let's go through it once again, whatever is highlighted.
Yes. So even if a vulnerability seems hard to exploit, it might be best to assume that it's easily exploitable and you just haven't figured out how yet. He also mentions how it's somewhat incorrect to call this thread anything about disclosure. This thread is not about disclosure. Disclosure is when you tell the vendor. This thread is about publication, and that has very different implications. Publication is when you're sure you've told the prospective attackers. The last observation concerning the distinction between disclosure and publication is an important one. The easy part is responsible disclosure. The hard part is sensible publishing. I think sensible publishing talks about how you are trying to attack the vulnerability that you have figured out, or trying to tell the prospective attackers of how to exploit it. And that is the hard part. And this thread is more about that than responsible disclosure, which is the easy part. If you figure it out, you just communicate to the developer that, hey, this is a vulnerability which might be exploited. But
I think
actually trying to find that exploit.
I think responsible disclosure is disclosing it with like a close entourage of people, like the developers who can make amendments and fix it, and publishing is just leaking out the information to everybody. And you're not distinguishing between people who care about the network and who don't care about network. So like if you find a bug in Bitcoin, the responsible disclosure would be informing it to Bitcoin code developers and asking them to fix it. Sensible publishing would be just tweeting it maybe on Twitter so that everybody knows, and even those who want to exploit it can do so.
Right. Yep. So we are at the mark of the session. So do you want to continue, or do you think it's...
Let's wrap it up here. I think we'll take the 9th chapter next time.
Yeah, let's try to just skim through. So I did skim through before, and I think the rest of the book is sort of very detailed and covers obscure details, but we can go over it in the next session if you think it's valuable. But just your
I think you
thoughts
should, consult Raj. Even I feel that way, that it's better to skip it.
Right.
So just because we've done that before, even when we were doing LBTC and we skipped the final few sections because they were like very advanced. So just consult Raj and let him know. Maybe he'll let you know whether to conduct this book next week or to start with another one.
Right, that makes sense. And about the other books, so I will conduct a poll now. I think the discussion that we had converged to Book of Satoshi and Block Size Wars. I think something like Broken Money will be too tangential to Bitshala, and a book like Book of Satoshi and Block Size Wars would be perfect. So I'll consult Raj because they are still non-technical books, but I think they cover a lot of the social layer of Bitcoin while still covering the technical details. So they might be interesting reads. I haven't read Book of Satoshi, but Block Size War is definitely very interesting. It might, so where this is my opinion again.
Block Size War is a book Block Size War is a book that will make the session very interactive because different people will have different opinions. So it's something that will engage the audiences a lot. So if I had to choose between the two that you mentioned, I'd rather read Book of Satoshi on my own and have a discussion with the community of Bitcoiners on Block Size War. It'll be fun.
Okay, great. I'll put up a poll and people can vote this. I think I'm also going for Block Size Wars. And it's actually very interesting because it gives you an idea of how soft forks happen in Bitcoin. And it briefly covers Taproot and most of it is covering SegWit. And I think SegWit was historically the biggest proposal upgrade to Bitcoin. So it's nice to know the entire history around it.
Right.
So yeah, let's
put up a poll and then we'll see what we come up.
Yeah, if you come across any other relevant text, let me know because I think Austin economics might not be suited to this forum. I would have personally loved to do that. So I'll consult Raj personally if we can. You also do that. If he thinks we can have a separate economics section in the Discord server.
Yeah, I'd love to have that. Maybe a weekly session on Austrian economics. I think, you can talk to Raj and also like convey to him that, even I'm vouching for it. So you can maybe that lad weight. So let's say I definitely believe that Austrian economics is something that we should discuss because the social debate can erupt out of anything. You can discuss something technical and even out of that you might start discussing things that are social or current affairs or something like that. It's not specific to Austrian economics. It's very relevant to Bitcoin. So I'd be like very happy because we have a few days weekend. I think Tuesdays we don't have anything and Saturdays we don't have anything. So if we can accommodate a session on Austrian economics, even if it is for 30 minutes, not a 1 hour session, then it'll be great.
Right, makes sense. Okay, I'll take this up with Raj. And about this as well, I will try to pitch for Block Size Wars more. Book of Satoshi, I don't think many people will be interested, but I will still put up a poll. I don't think any other books, the Bitcoin Standard and Broken Money, might not be relevant to Bitshala. Those are two economics based, and for that I will take up with Raj separately.
All right, fine then. Done for the day. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for joining, guys.
Take a good night.
Thank you, Jatin. Yeah. Thank you, Veronica. Bye.
Bye.